Okay, let's talk about how we go about writing a conclusion. So the purpose of a conclusion is to bring your paper to what's called a unified end, bring some resolution to the topic, and kind of leave your audience thinking. So the three things we want to do in a persuasive conclusion is 1, restate your thesis or reaffirm the argument you made over the course of the paper. You want to summarize your reasoning or the main points that you made in your body paragraphs, and then you want to bring it to some sort of meaningful end. So how do we do that? For our introductions, we talked about the inverted method. For a conclusion, we can kind of just flip that and do the reverse. So we're going to start really specific and kind of build to this broad, meaningful end. So if you look at my little diagram here over on the right, it looks just like the one we had for introduction, just reversed. We're going to start with restating the argument we made over the course of the paper. So that's what I have right here in red. The next part in the yellow is where we're going to summarize those main claims. And then we're going to end with this big blue part, which is how do we bring it to the broader context? How do we create that meaningful end? That's where we kind of leave our audience with something to think about. So let's look at an example for some context here. As I read the example, I'm going to go through and kind of highlight the different pieces, just so you can see how this kind of lines up with the diagram I just showed you on the previous screen. So let me change my highlighter color here. The first sentence, it says, school uniforms simply have no place in public schools. Opposition will continue to argue that uniforms are the only way to combat bullying, but this view is simplistic. As discussed, there are a host of different methods to combat inequality between students, and at the end of the day, nothing is more important than preserving what makes every student unique. Those who would go against the current, who embrace what makes them unique, are the ones who go on to make history. Silencing that individuality in students would be an incredible mistake. So before we kind of color code this, I'm going to go in and look for these 3 parts of my diagram. The first part is I'm going to look for where I restated my thesis. So if you noticed, the first sentence in my sample says, school uniforms simply have no place in public schools. That is the same thesis from my introduction. I've just reworded it a little bit to kind of reaffirm the argument that I've made over the course of my body paragraphs. The next part is where I start talking about the opposition and what I discussed in the paper. So again, that is where, let me switch to yellow, we start creating that summary of reasoning and main points. So opposition will continue to argue that uniforms are the only way to combat bullying, but this view is simplistic, presenting, like I said, one of the main points from the paper. As discussed, there are a host of different methods to combat inequality between students, and at the end of the day, nothing is more important than preserving what makes every student unique. Again, I'm kind of reviewing the arguments I could have made in this paper, such as this one right here. We need to preserve individuality, kind of countering this idea that uniforms are the only way to fight bullying. Like I said, just kind of recapping the main ideas that would have appeared in the body paragraphs of this essay. And then the last part, that's kind of where we're bringing it to that meaningful end. And when I say meaningful end, I like to think of that as the so what. So that's where we start talking about people who go against the current making history, being unique, that it would be a mistake to kind of limit that. This whole part here is where we're kind of establishing that broader context or the so what of the argument we're making. So essentially, like I said, you want those 3 things. We want a restatement of our thesis right here. We want the recap of the argument that we made, getting the 2 positions that were discussed in the body paragraphs, or kind of the main claims you made throughout the paper, before ending with a so what or why should the audience care.